In the early 1930s, Europe stood on the brink of another war, though few could see it yet. Germany was rearming, and the skies above Europe were changing faster than anyone could grasp. The new generation of bombers, sleek, metal, and fast, could now reach London from the Rhineland in less than an hour. To the British Air Ministry, the message was clear. If another war came, Britain could be destroyed from the air before its army ever fired a shot. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had once warned Parliament that the bomber will always get through. He was wrong, but no one knew that yet. In 1935, a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt, who worked for the National Physical Laboratory, received an unusual assignment from the Air Ministry. They wanted to know whether a so-called death ray could destroy enemy aircraft using radio waves, a concept that had captured the imagination of pulp magazines and politicians alike. Watson Watt laughed. A death ray was fantasy, he said. But detecting aircraft with radio waves? That, he believed, was possible. Within weeks, he and his assistant Arnold Wilkins began testing the theory. On February 26, 1935, they set up an experiment near Daventry, broadcasting from a BBC radio tower while measuring reflections from a passing Handley Page bomber. To their amazement, the radio signal wavered as the aircraft crossed the beam. The world's first radar detection had just taken place, quietly on a foggy English morning. Watson Watt sent a memo to the Air Ministry titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. In calm language, it described a weapon more powerful than any bomb, the ability to see the enemy long before he struck. The Air Ministry immediately classified the project as top secret. A small team of scientists was formed under Watson Watt's leadership, codenamed the Bawdsey Research Station after the remote manor house on England's eastern coast, where they moved in 1936. There, engineers worked around the clock on a detection system using radio waves reflected from metal aircraft. They built oscillators, receivers, and massive antenna arrays, each one stretching hundreds of feet into the sky. The scientists were not soldiers. They wore lab coats instead of uniforms, but they understood that time was running out. By 1938, Hitler had reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and demanded Czechoslovakia. War was coming, and Britain's skies were its first battlefield. Watson Watt's team developed an early warning network that could track aircraft up to 120 miles away. Each site used towering steel masts to send out radio pulses and nearby receiver towers to detect their echoes. When multiple stations worked together, controllers could triangulate the altitude, speed, and direction of incoming aircraft. It was revolutionary. But to the average British citizen, the tall metal towers springing up along the coast looked like nothing more than strange scaffolding. They were called chain home. By the summer of 1939, 20 of these radar stations lined England's east and south coasts, from Scotland to the Isle of Wight. Behind the towers was a network of control rooms and underground cables linking everything to RAF Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, near London. There, officers sat before large plotting tables, marking enemy tracks with coloured counters, while women of the WAAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, updated maps in real time as radar signals came in. Britain, a nation that lacked the manpower and aircraft to match Germany, now had something far more valuable: information. Radar would give the RAF minutes, sometimes half an hour, of warning before enemy bombers arrived. It would allow squadrons to take off only when needed, conserving fuel and pilots. The system was still crude. It could not distinguish friend from foe and often missed aircraft flying low. But it worked. When Hitler's invasion of Poland began in September 1939 and war was declared, Britain's chain of radar stations quietly came online. Above the cliffs of Dover and the beaches of Suffolk, strange mechanical towers scanned the skies, searching for what everyone knew was coming. They would soon become the most important machines in Europe, the invisible eyes of Britain's defence. By early 1940, the towering radar masts that dotted Britain's coasts had become the quiet guardians of an island preparing for war. Few knew what they were or why they mattered. To local villagers, they were simply the strange skeletons by the sea. To Britain's enemies, they were invisible, literally and figuratively. Only a handful of officers within RAF Fighter Command and the Air Ministry understood the scale of what was being built. A technological fortress made not of concrete or steel, but of radio waves and mathematics. At Bentley Priory, headquarters of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was building a defensive system that would soon become legendary. Dowding, a quiet and methodical man, realized that radar alone was useless unless its information could reach pilots fast enough to act. So he oversaw the creation of the world's first integrated air defense network, a living system that linked radar stations, ground observers, radio operators, and fighter squadrons into a single coordinated machine. Every radar station sent its findings to one of 4 sector control rooms, where teams plotted the aircraft on large maps. The information was passed instantly to group headquarters, then to the airfields. Within minutes, a controller could scramble fighters and guide them straight to the enemy's position. It was an elegant marriage of science and strategy, the first digital age command structure built decades before the computer. This Dowding system, as it would later be known, became the unseen backbone of Britain's defence. Without it, radar's discoveries would have been just numbers flickering on screens. With it, they became action. Yet secrecy was absolute. The entire project operated under the cover term RDF, Radio Direction Finding, to disguise its purpose. Even within the RAF, few pilots understood what it truly did. They were simply told that headquarters somehow always knew when the enemy was coming. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Germany was watching, but not seeing. The Luftwaffe's intelligence division, led by Colonel Joseph Schmid, had noted the appearance of tall metal towers along the British coast as early as 1938. Analysts filed reports suggesting that they might be related to early warning systems, but the information was dismissed. To the German High Command, the idea that radio waves could guide an entire air defence seemed absurd. They believed Britain's radar technology was primitive and unreliable. In truth, the system was growing stronger by the week. By the spring of 1940, more than 20 radar stations were active. Britain could now track aircraft from as far away as Calais, and even detect planes forming up over northern France before they crossed the Channel. Dowding and Watson Watt had given the RAF what Germany could not match: time. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, the RAF sent squadrons across the Channel to help, but by June, the British Expeditionary Force was retreating toward Dunkirk. The evacuation was a success, but it left Britain exposed. Hitler's armies stood across the water, and the Luftwaffe prepared to destroy the RAF ahead of the planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Dowding knew it was coming. Every night, radar operators watched new signals flicker to life on their scopes as German aircraft assembled across the French coast. The towers of the Chain Home network stood ready. Each pulse of energy that rippled through the sky was a heartbeat of Britain's invisible shield. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. It started with probing attacks along the coast, bombers escorted by fighters testing Britain's defences. German commanders were puzzled by how quickly British fighters arrived each time. The raids were supposed to catch the RAF unprepared, yet Hurricanes and Spitfires seemed to rise from the clouds within minutes. Schmid's intelligence staff began investigating again. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes took photos of the tall steel towers near Dover and Bawdsey. But when the images reached Berlin, they were misinterpreted as part of Britain's civil radio network. Incredibly, the Luftwaffe never launched a coordinated effort to destroy them. So the radar stations continued to operate night after night, painting the sky with unseen light. Operators, many of them young women, sat before cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms, listening to the hum of the equipment and watching green blips crawl across the screens. Each echo meant a German formation, each flicker a life-or-death warning. They passed the information by phone to the plotting rooms, where the WAF teams moved coloured blocks on large tables to mark enemy raids. The system worked so efficiently that squadrons often met bombers at the exact point of interception. RAF pilots began to trust that mysterious voice over the radio that always seemed to know where the enemy would appear. Meanwhile, the Germans grew frustrated. They thought the RAF must have hundreds more fighters than they actually did. They could not understand how British squadrons seemed to be everywhere at once. They did not know that what they faced was not numerical strength, but information dominance, the world's first real-time battlefield network. By August, the Luftwaffe escalated the offensive, unaware that every move they made was already being tracked before they even reached the sea. The stage was set for radar's true test, the coming storm over the skies of southern England that would decide the fate of Europe. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen, and the Nazi flag flew over Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees. Across the Channel, the German war machine assembled for the next phase of conquest, the destruction of the Royal Air Force and the invasion of England itself. The German plan, Operation Sea Lion, relied on one key assumption: that the Luftwaffe would sweep the RAF from the skies in a matter of weeks. With air superiority won, the invasion barges waiting at Calais would cross the Channel unopposed, but that plan was already doomed, and Germany didn't know it. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. Waves of German bombers, escorted by fighters, swept toward the English coast. On radar screens in dark, windowless rooms along the shoreline, operators watched the echoes form, ghostly green arcs appearing over the Channel. Within seconds, the coordinates were telephoned to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory. There, women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF, stood around a massive map table, moving coloured blocks to represent squadrons and enemy raids. Telephones buzzed. Controllers issued orders. Within minutes, airfields across southern England erupted into life. Pilots ran for their Spitfires and Hurricanes, engines roaring as they took off in groups of 12, guided not by chance but by unseen hands watching from afar. Radar had given Britain a new kind of vision. For the first time in history, a nation could see its attackers coming long before they arrived. The Luftwaffe never understood how it was possible. Their reconnaissance flights photographed the tall radar towers again and again, but intelligence officers continued to dismiss them as radio masts for civilian communication. Meanwhile, their own early warning systems, primitive Freya and Würzburg sets, were few in number and far less effective. Each morning, German bomber groups formed up over France in neat formations. Each afternoon, British fighters appeared out of the clouds to meet them head-on. The Germans believed it was luck. It wasn't. It was chain home. The system detected raids up to 120 miles away, allowing Dowding's fighter command to concentrate limited resources where they were most needed. Britain could afford to fight efficiently. Germany could not. For every 10 aircraft the Luftwaffe sent across the Channel, only a fraction reached their targets. Many never returned. Inside the control rooms, the atmosphere was tense but methodical. Operators spoke in clipped tones, tracking raids with grease pencils on transparent screens. Raid approaching Dover, altitude 15,000, speed 220. In the air, RAF pilots heard a calm voice through static. Bandits, Angels 15, heading 210. Those were the only words they needed. The system was working perfectly, a blend of human instinct and electronic precision. By mid-August, the Germans escalated. Hitler grew impatient. The Luftwaffe began Adlerangriff, Operation Eagle Attack, a full-scale offensive on the RAF's airfields and radar stations. For the first time, the German bombers targeted the coastal radar towers. On August 12th, attacks struck stations at Ventnor, Pevensey, and Rye. Bombs fell among the masts, destroying power lines and shattering equipment. For a few hours, some stations went silent. But the network had been designed with redundancy. Overlapping coverage meant that even if one radar went down, others filled the gap. Within 24 hours, the damaged sites were back online. German commanders believed they had destroyed the British early warning system. In reality, it had barely flinched. Then, in September, Hitler made a fatal decision. Frustrated by the RAF's resilience, he ordered the bombing of London itself, the Blitz. That shift in strategy gave Fighter Command something it desperately needed: breathing room. With radar still intact, the RAF could now anticipate every incoming raid, intercept the bombers en route, and strike from advantageous positions. The effect was devastating for the Germans. They lost nearly 1,700 aircraft in 3 months, while the RAF remained intact. The Luftwaffe's losses were so severe that even their experienced crews began to doubt victory. By October 1940, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion. Britain would not be invaded. For the first time in the war, Germany had been stopped, not by a larger army or superior weapons, but by a handful of scientists and engineers who had turned radio waves into a wall of defense. After the battle, pilots often credited their survival to the system, though few fully understood what it was. To them, it was as if some unseen guardian watched the skies and whispered warnings into their ears. In a sense, that was true. Behind every victory claim, behind every enemy bomber shot down over Kent or Sussex, there had been a young woman at a radar console, tracing a green flicker with her pencil, and changing history. As autumn came and the Luftwaffe retreated to the continent, the radar towers kept turning, scanning the empty skies. Their steel frames were scarred and rusted from salt and wind, but they had held the line. The Battle of Britain was over. And for the first time, Britain had proven that technology, not just courage, could decide the fate of nations. When the smoke cleared over southern England in late 1940, the people of Britain believed they had survived the Battle of Britain through sheer courage. Newspapers praised the pilots as the few, and rightly so. But very few people understood that the true hero of the battle was a technology so secret it couldn't even be named. Radar remained Britain's best-kept secret. Even many pilots who owed their lives to its warnings were never told how their controllers always seemed to know where the enemy would appear. The tall towers that lined the coast continued to hum and rotate, scanning the skies silently while the war shifted elsewhere. Inside Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding knew the truth. Without the chain-home network, the RAF would have been blind. It had allowed his limited squadrons to fight at the right time, in the right place, against overwhelming odds. He called it our unseen armour. By 1941, the radar system had become even more advanced. Scientists at Bawdsey, working under Robert Watson Watt and his protégé Edward Bowen, developed new centimetric radar that could fit into aircraft and ships. The same principle that had saved Britain's skies was now adapted to hunt submarines, guide bombers at night, and direct anti-aircraft guns with pinpoint precision. The secret spread quietly through the Allied war effort. On land, radar-controlled guns defended London from the Blitz. At sea, it helped convoys detect U-boats before they attacked. In the air, it guided bombers through fog and darkness toward their targets. Britain shared this knowledge with its allies under the Tizard mission, a 1940 scientific exchange that sent the country's most sensitive research, including radar designs, jet engine plans, and nuclear theories, to the United States and Canada. The Americans were stunned. "Britain has given us the crown jewels," one US scientist wrote. The result was a partnership that accelerated Allied science by years. At MIT, American engineers built radar sets using Britain's magnetron design, the compact device that made radar truly practical. Within 2 years, thousands of radar-equipped aircraft, ships, and submarines were in Allied service. From the North Atlantic to El Alamein, from Normandy to Okinawa, radar became the silent language of Allied victory. And still, the Germans never fully grasped what had happened in 1940. Captured Luftwaffe pilots insisted that British fighters had appeared out of nowhere, as if summoned by fate. German engineers, who later examined British radar installations after the war, were astonished to find how extensive and effective the system had been. One German officer admitted, "We had nothing like it. We did not even imagine it." After the war, the story began to emerge. At the Bawdsey Research Station, the scientists who had worked in secrecy were finally honoured. Watson Watt was knighted. Dowding, though quietly pushed into retirement, lived to see his system credited as one of the decisive innovations of the century. Chainholme's towers, rusting and silent, were left standing, monuments to a war won by intelligence rather than numbers. The legacy of that invention reached far beyond Britain's shores. The radar revolution transformed aviation, meteorology, navigation, and even space exploration. The same principles that detected bombers in 1940 would one day guide spacecraft through the void. But in that desperate summer, it had done something even greater. It had kept a nation alive. In the words of Winston Churchill, who knew the secret but never revealed it during the war, "All hearts go out to the fighter pilots whose brilliant actions we see with our eyes. But behind them, unseen, are the scientists who built the light that guides them." When historians look back at the Battle of Britain, they see courage, sacrifice, and strategy, but also a quiet hum of electricity and the glow of a green line across a screen. That light was Britain's salvation. Radar did not just win a battle, it redefined what it meant to fight a war. In the age of machines, the victor would no longer be the one with the largest army or the heaviest guns, but the one who could see first. And in 1940, thanks to a handful of visionaries working on a lonely stretch of coastline, Britain saw everything.